Hello everyone, and today we're going to be showing you the Japanese emperor's line of succession. As you can clearly see behind me, I have built a family tree of the emperors of Japan going all the way back to the Edo period in 1603 with Emperor Go-Yozei all the way to the modern day with Emperor Naruhito. And we're going to be going through all of the emperors today that have ruled between that time period. So before we get started, be sure to smash that like button. And let's get into this thing. So Japan holds a couple records. There's a reason its monarchy is so fascinating. For one, it is the only monarchy today in the world that still uses the title emperor. So that's pretty cool. It is also the longest running monarchy, dating all the way back to 711 BC. And it is solely agnatic, meaning that it is a strict male-only line. You can take the current Emperor of Japan, Naruhito, traced his father-to-father line all the way back to 700 BC with the first Emperor Jimmu. Now, why aren't we doing all the emperors in this video? Well, that's because there have been about 126 emperors to rule Japan, and if this video does well enough, I'll hit those up. But for now, the Edo period just makes the most sense to start. So, the Edo period begins in 1603, but before we start on that, we need to back up a little bit. So, Emperor Go-Yozei is the first emperor to preside over the Edo period. Now, he succeeded his grandfather in the year 1586. His father, Prince Sanahito, died just months before his father did, and so the throne jumped straight to his grandson, Go-Yozei. Go-Yozei ruled from 1586 to 1611. Go-Yozei took the throne in the previous period known as the Sentoku period, which was the era of warring states. Japan had been undergoing a civil war and internal crises for the last 150 years up to this point. Until in the year 1603, in the middle of his reign, a shogun, very powerful military leader named Tokugawa Ieyasu, took over the previous shogunate and became the sole ruling power in the land. Keep in mind as we go through this, unlike most monarchies at the time, Japan's emperor had very little power to speak of. The shogun was really in charge of the government, and Tokugawa Ieyasu moved the capital of Japan from Kyoto to Edo, and Edo is modern-day Tokyo. They didn't change the name until the Meiji Restoration, but it was called the Edo back then. So the Tokugawa shogunate moved the capital to Edo, while as all of the emperors that you're going to see here today mostly lived in Kyoto, which was the old capital. So Go-Yozei lived and reigned until 1611 before abdicating the throne for his eldest son, Go-Mizunoo. Now, Go-Yozei actually had a 6-year retirement, and this is a very common practice amongst Japanese emperors. Since they didn't have much power, once the Japanese emperors decided that it was, I'm about done being emperor, I'm getting old or whatnot, they would abdicate the throne, meaning they give up the throne for their son. So Go-Yozei decided in 1611, you know what, I'm just going to give up the throne. Go-Mizunoo took the throne. Now keep in mind that Go-Yozei was not known by this name during his lifetime. This is a very common tradition, and it happens to all emperors in Japanese history. Let's go over to the modern side of the tree to discuss how this works. So let's take Emperor Taisho, for example. The emperors' names that you see here are associated with their era that they rule in. They achieve these names posthumously, meaning after their death. So Taisho here was known as Yashihito in his younger years, which Yashihito was his personal name, and it is actually inappropriate to refer to the emperor in this way in Japan. So as Taisho was ruling as Emperor Yashihito, the people of Japan just called him the Emperor, His Majesty the Emperor. And so after his death, he was given the name Taisho. So all of these emperors you're going to see in this video all got these names posthumously, meaning they were never known by this when they were alive. So Go-Yozei was emperor during what is known as the Go-Yozei era. He had 2 sons. His eldest son achieved the throne, Emperor Go-Mizunoo, in 1611. He had a younger son who was Prince Gyonin, who lived from 1602 to 1661, although he never achieved the throne, but he was a prince, lived about 59 years. Emperor Go-Mizunoo was not a fan of the Tokugawa shogunate at all, and he wanted the emperor to have more power than it did. So, in order to keep the Japanese people associated with the emperor, he was very philosophical. He made sure that Japan stayed with its primitive traditional ways with art and literature and things like that. He promoted for Japanese citizens in Kyoto to continue to use their old-fashioned art and not break away from the Tokugawa. So what he did, he made a very political marriage upon himself, marrying the daughter of the second Tokugawa shogunate, Hidetada, who was the son of Tokugawa Ieyasu. He married his daughter. That way, the Tokugawa shogunate, because he was afraid that the Tokugawa shogunate was going to break away from the imperial throne and form their own sort of Japan, dethroning the emperor. Although the emperor was pretty much a de facto ruling position at this time, Go-Mizunoo wanted to make sure that they stayed in check. Check. Those cats represent Go-Mizunoo and the Tokugawa. So, he married her in 1620. She bore him one daughter, who, by the time he abdicated the throne in 1629, succeeded him as Empress Meisho. The only reason Meisho even became an empress is because Go-Mizunoo's son, his eldest son, Go-Komyo, was too young to succeed him. And so she would rule as kind of his regent until he got old enough. Japan is very strict about this rule. Only males are allowed to inherit the throne, and that male has to come from a strict male-only line. So if it's a grandson of a female, that person cannot inherit the throne. It has to be a strict son-to-son succession. So, as you can see, Go-Mizunoo resigned the throne in 1629, but he didn't die until 1680, the whopping age of 84, which is very impressive for the 1600s. So, Empress Meisho died in 1696. The nobles in Japan forced her to abdicate in 1643 in favor of Go-Mizunoo's eldest son, Go-Komyo. Now, Go-Mizunoo kept having children after he abdicated the throne, and most scholars like to suggest that he had well over 35, 36 children in his entire life. So that is pretty insane. He was having more than one wife. This was his first wife. He had several wives, and he had many, many illegitimate children. But Go-Komyo succeeded Meisho, as he was a son from a previous marriage. This right here is the Tokugawa symbol. So that is the Tokugawa shogunate. That's what that is. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. So Go-Komyo succeeded the throne in 1643. However, during the reign of Empress Meisho, the Tokugawa shogunate made a very bold move. They decided to issue an isolationist policy throughout the entire country of Japan, formally locking up the country. No one was allowed to come in, and no one was allowed to leave, with very few exceptions. Often if somebody tried to leave or come in, they would be put to death. The Tokugawas executed this. The emperor had no say about this at all. And this policy would last for the next 200 years. Go-Mizunoo, the former emperor, was not happy about this, and he actually tried to set up a force to take out the shogunate, but all of those attempts failed because the shogun had bigger army supremacy. So Go-Mizunoo, for the rest of his life, protested against the shogunate, against the Tokugawa, to get Japanese people to kind of go back, like I said, to their primitive ways of art and literature, which they did for the most part. However, he did die in 1680 during the reign of his final son, Ryujin. But Go-Komyo ruled from 1643 to 1654. He actually died fairly young without any sons. So he didn't have any sons to succeed him when he died in 1654. So the throne went to his brother, Go-Sai. Now, the second son of Go-Mizunoo, Priest Sucho, was a priest. Therefore, when the Japanese nobility made themselves a priest, devoting themselves to Buddhism, they basically gave up their entire rights to the imperial throne for both themselves and their children. But when you're a priest, you can't have children. So That's how that goes. So Go-Sai ended up succeeding Go-Komyo. Keep in mind, during all this time, Go-Mizunoo is still alive. So he rules from 1654 to 1663. He has a couple children, most notably during the reign of Go-Sai, one of a really overshadowed event in human history that no one talks about. In the city of Edo, which is where the Tokugawa was residing, there was a great fire. It's known today as the Great Fire of Tokyo. It happened in 1657, which is estimated to have killed 100,000 people, which is absolutely insane. Which most people today consider some of the worst fires in human history to be, the Great Fire of London in 1666, which was only around this time, and the Great Chicago Fire. Those numbers completely child's play compared to the fire at Edo. The fire in Tokyo was so bad that it took hundreds of years for the city to rebuild itself. And Japan went through great economic decline during this period. So the main reason all this happened was Tokyo was, all the houses were all the buildings were all like enclosed with each other. And they were all made out of wood. So once one fire started, it basically burnt down the entire city. 100,000 people killed, which is something that you don't hear a lot about in the West because we tend to not talk about Asian history too much. But that's a big deal. That all happened during Go-Sai's reign. Now, Go-Sai was an interesting fellow because he abdicated in 1663 after only being on the throne for 9 years. He had 2 sons that could have succeeded him. But for whatever reason, Go-Sai abdicated, and he dubbed both of his sons to be ineligible to rule. So Prince Yokiko Agusurima and Kobun Prince, as well as his grandson Tadahito, were all bypassed for the 19th son of Go-Mizunoo, Emperor Ryujin, the final surviving son. So Go-Sai decided to give up the throne for all of his descendants and himself just for Emperor Ryujin to succeed him. Like I said, was the 19th and final son of Go-Mizunoo, who ruled from 1663 all the way to 1687. Go-Mizunoo finally died during his reign. So, how would you like to be his son? Not happy. However, there was no potential claimants because Prince Kobun died in 1716 without any children, and Prince Tadahito also died without any children. So that line the line would have ended up going to Ryujin after all anyway, but it still kind of sucks. So Ryujin ruled for about 24 years, but he lived all the way until 1732. So he abdicated pretty early on. He had 2 sons, the eldest of which being Emperor Higashiyama, who succeeded him in 1687. He ruled all the way until 1709, dying at the relatively young age of 34. Now, Ryujin had another son here, Prince Yorihito Agusurima. Now, this title is pretty much the highest position besides the crown prince in Japanese society. So these 2 sons here of Go-Sai's eldest son was given this title since he couldn't take the throne. So he died in 1699, and then Prince Tadahito got the Arasugoanima title. But when he died without sons, it passed to the second son of Ryujin instead. And that line continued all the way until 1947, when the male line finally became extinct. So that title was used up until the end of the Second World War, and then shortly after, that last stadtholder died. So Higashiyama dies in 1710, just a year after he leaves the throne in 1709. So he's got 2 sons as well, the eldest of which being Emperor Nakamikato. Nakamikato ruled from 1709 to 1735, a 26-year reign, the longest reign yet of these emperors. He died in 1737, resigning the throne just 2 years before he died for his one and only son, Emperor Sakuramachi. Now, I gotta get down here because I built this all on the wall. Alright, we're down on the ground now because I continued the tree on the ground. So, Sakuramachi succeeds the throne at age 15 in 1735 and rules until 1747. He dies at a very young age of 30, just in time to have 2 children. So when Sakuramachi died, his 5-year-old son, Emperor Momozono, became emperor. Now, he was only 5 years old at the time, and he only ruled for about 15 years. He died at the young age of 20. just old enough to have a son right before he died, just 4 years before he died in 1758, Emperor Go-Momozono. Now, if you're wondering what the Go means, it is basically Go Sakuramachi succeeded the throne upon Momozono's death, as his son was too young to rule. So his sister briefly took the throne until his son was old enough. But that Go prefix basically translates in English to the younger or the second. So this is basically, you can think of this as being Go Sakuramachi as being Sakuramachi the second, basically. So she rules from 1762 to 1771. Now, she actually all the way lives up until 1813, but like I said, she only is put in the empress position as a placeholder until Momozono's son, Go-Momozono, is old enough to rule, that being 13 years old. So when Go-Momozono turned 13 years old, his aunt was forced to abdicate in favor of him. But it was short-lived because Go-Momozono died in 1779 at the age of 21 with no children. And seeing as this caused quite a bit of a succession crisis, as his father was the only son of Sakuramachi, who in turn was the only son of Nakamikato. So the throne had to jump all the way to this branch here, Nakamikato's brother, Naruhito Kennomiya, who was born in 1704. He was dead by the time Go-Momozono died, and Higashima's second son. So both of these branches descend from Emperor Higashiyama, as there were no more male line descendants of Nakamikato upon the death of Go-Momozono. So, after Kennomiya died, Tsukihito Kennomiya was now the most senior person in this line. But the throne, when Go-Momozono died, ended up going to the third son of Tsukihito Kennomiya, Emperor Kokoku. Now, Kokoku, you're probably wondering, why did the third son accede the throne and his first two brothers were bypassed even when his father was still alive? Well, you see, when it was clear that Go-Momozono was dying, his aunt made a bold move. She told Go-Momozono to adopt his second cousin once removed, Emperor Kokoku, as his heir. This was a very common practice during the Roman Empire. A lot of times, Roman emperors would adopt sons, kind of like how Julius Caesar adopted Octavian to be Augustus, and in turn adopted Tiberius. That was kind of that type of symbolic move between Go-Momozono and Kokoku. So Go-Momozono, right before he died, adopted Kokoku as the new emperor. So, as there were no male line descendants here. Now, these two brothers were not, these two imperial princes over here were not too upset about this. You think they would be upset about that decision? But you got to keep in mind that the Tokugawa is still really in charge of Japan. So even with the imperial title, it's pretty much more prestige than anything. There's really no point in ruling. You have really no power to speak of. That's why there was no wars going on between these individuals. So Kokoku ruled all the way until 1817. Dying in 1840. He abdicated the throne in 1817 for his son. Now, the tree, actually, my wall is not big enough to feature the entire tree, so we need to move over to this wall. Kokoku's eldest son was Emperor Ninko, actually his only son. So Ninko became emperor in 1817, and he lived all the way until 1846, dying on the throne. Now, Ninko, in turn, was actually the third cousin of Go-Momozono down here. However, he's listed on this tree. So Emperor Ninko was succeeded in 1846 by his 15-year-old son, Emperor Komi. Now, Komi was a pretty vicious figure, although as being an emperor during the Edo period, couldn't really do much. He was not a fan of the Tokugawa. Emperor Ninko's daughter, Princess Chikako, is pretty notable. She married Tokugawa Shogunate Iemochi, who was one of the last Tokugawa shogunates to rule. He died in 1866, and he ruled from 1846 to 1866, being one of the last Tokugawa shogunates. Because when Emperor Komi was on the throne, a lot happened in Japan. The Tokugawa started to lose power significantly. And in 1852, U.S. President Millard Fillmore, yeah, you don't hear that name too much, issued a verdict to spread the United States' sphere of influence across the world to open up trade with the mysterious island nation of Japan that had been shut down for the last 200 years. President Fillmore sends Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan and arrives in 1853. Matthew Perry confronts the Tokugawa shogunate and forces them to open the country up to trade with the U.S. And as this happened, the Tokugawa started to lose a lot of power. And by the time Komi died in 1867, he was succeeded by his son, Emperor Meiji. And Meiji, in the first year of his reign, the second year of his reign, 1868, led a rebellion and took out the Tokugawa shogunate for good, bringing the power back to the emperor, forming what is known as the Japanese Empire. The shogunate was gone. The emperor had full control of the government again. And Meiji moved the capital to Tokyo, renamed the city, and became the sole ruling emperor. Meiji was very significant in Japanese history. This event is known as the Meiji Restoration. Meiji was on the throne for 45 years and ruled absolutely during that time. Meiji made many reforms, both politically and militarily, in Japan. Now, Japan, being closed off for the last 200 years, was very, very behind, culturally, behind many other European countries and things like that. He adopted a very Western society, kind of almost European-esque. He created a giant military that was very European-esque, with giant armies and things like that. The country was more open to relations with other countries, which had never been seen before in Japan. Now, Meiji made a big decision, just like most European countries were doing at this time. He decided to invade countries in Southeast Asia to increase Japan's power on the continent. Japan became very powerful during Meiji's reign, and he fought in and won the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, not only kicking Russia out of Southeast Asia, but also becoming the very first time in history that an Asian country beat a European country in a war. That had never happened pre-1905. And after that happened, people in Europe and stuff knew that Japan was up to business. A couple years later, in 1910, Meiji leads an army and invades and conquers all of Korea, establishing territories there. Japan became an imperial country at this time. Meiji died in 1912 after a 45-year reign, dying on the throne, leaving the throne to his son, Emperor Taisho, who was previously mentioned earlier. Taisho had a relatively short reign, 1912 to 1926. He did die on the throne, however. And one notable thing is Taisho, as you can see here, was emperor during World War I, the First World War. Now, Japan didn't really do a whole lot during the First World War. They were pretty much trying to stay in their own territories in Southeast Asia, as most of the First World War was fought in Europe. However, toward the middle stages and end of the war, Japan decided to join on the Allied side, and they were actually at the peace conference at the end of the war. And Japan ended up taking a bunch of Pacific islands from Germany. That's the main reason Japan wanted to be involved in the First World War, so they could take some territories and land at the aftermath, which a lot of the Allied powers did as they won. So since Germany lost that war, they had the German Empire owned a couple islands out in the Pacific and the East Indies that Japan was able to get after that. So Taisho did die on New Year's Eve of 1926, December 31st. He was succeeded by his eldest son, Emperor Showa, more commonly known in the West as Hirohito. Hirohito was emperor during World War II, but before that, he was a very powerful emperor, being the third emperor of the Japanese Empire. The Imperial Japan only saw 3 emperors. Showa, in 1931, decided to invade Manchuria, and in 1937, invaded China, allowing for the Japanese Empire to pretty much triple in size. And an event known as the Rape of Nanking took place, which is one of the worst and most bloody massacres in the history of Asia. Basically, the Rape of Nanking, think of the Holocaust in Germany. Basically what that was in Asia. So, A lot of people did not like Japan at this time, but it was without a doubt Japan was very powerful. And by the time 1940 came around, Hitler had just invaded France and he needs some help. So he calls up Emperor Hirohito in Japan and asks them to join the Axis, which they do. So Japan joins the Axis powers in the Second World War. Now, Hirohito, once the war is over, he does not get killed. Japan, famously, at the end of the war, gets hit with 2 nuclear bombs by the United States, ending the Pacific Theater altogether, as they lose a lot of their territories. At the end of the Second World War, the Japanese Empire came to an end, which led to the execution of a lot of his top leading generals. Now, as you all probably know, the top leading people in the Axis powers, like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler, and Japanese Imperial Prime Minister, military Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were all executed right at the end of the war. Hideki Tojo a couple years later. And a lot of people don't really know why Hirohito wasn't executed either. Well, the Americans pretty much took full occupation of Japan after this. And the president at the time, Harry Truman, and most people in the United States knew that Japan was built on tradition. And they believed that keeping the emperor alive would help Japan stay unified during this period of instability. So that's why Emperor Hirohito's life was spared. But a lot of the Japanese people weren't too fond of Hirohito during his life because he refused to talk about the war for the rest of his life. And he lived all the way until 1989, making him the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history, 63 years on the throne, and also one of the longest reigning monarchs in history, period. Certainly one of the longest reigning emperors. So he died all the way in 1989, like I said, not really talking about the war, never mentioning the war once after he died, starting the modern era. Showa becomes a constitutional monarch, which means he's pretty much more or less a figurehead, just like all of his ancestors had been. But he still continues to be there as the head of state, just like his successors. Showa died in 1989, Hirohito, succeeded by his son Akihito. Now, Akihito is still known by this name as he is not dead. Akihito succeeded the throne in 1989, abdicated in 2019, making him the first emperor to abdicate since Kokaku back in 1817. He was the last emperor to abdicate in 200 years, which is saying something because all of his ancestors here all died on the throne. So he brought back that tradition. Akihito is still alive today. As of time of making this video, he is currently 90 years old. He was born in 1933, so that's pretty cool. He has a younger brother who is also still alive, who is in line to the throne. Akihito's son, Naruhito, is the current emperor of Japan. He's been ruling since 2019, and he was born in 1960, making him 64 years old today. Now, there was a bit of uncertainty because after Naruhito is 64 years old and is unlikely to produce any sons. He has one daughter, Princess Toshi, but as rules go in Japan, females are not allowed to inherit the throne. So by the time Naruhito dies, he's actually going to be succeeded by his brother, Crown Prince Fumihito, and then his son, Prince Hisahito, who was born in 2006 and is currently 18 years old. So this is the future of the monarchy. Now, this Akihito only had 2 sons, and Fumihito only had 1 son. So pretty much Japan's monarchy is almost completely screwed succession-wise. It's very in risk of a succession crisis because after these people, the next person in the line of succession is Akihito's brother, Hidehito. Now, you're probably wondering, who are all these people over here? Well, this line has died out. Emperor Taisho had 4 sons in total, Hirohito being the eldest. Now, Hirohito and his youngest son were the only ones who actually produced sons. His second and third son, Yasuhito Chichibu and Nobuhito Takamatsu, both died without sons. Now, Yasuhito Chichibu was a pretty influential military leader during the Second World War, along with his brother, Emperor Showa. But these 2 both died. The youngest son of Emperor Taisho is Takahito, Prince Mikasa, who actually lived from 1915 all the way until 2016, dying just 2 months before he would have turned 101 years old. Now that is a long freaking life. However, all three, he lived so long that he outlived all three of his sons, and although 2 of his sons did produce children, they were only daughters. And so Prince Mikasa's line is dead. His 3 sons all died relatively young in their 50s and 60s and are not able to inherit. Now, Prince Mikasa was actually still alive when I created this YouTube channel. So, take into consideration, when I was doing those plush videos when I first started this channel about 8 years ago, the brother of the Japanese emperor during World War II was still alive. And his wife is still alive today. She is currently 101. She just turned 101 a couple weeks ago on June 4th. She was born in 1923. So, Prince Mikasa's line is completely dead. Now, Fumihito, like I said, is the heir presumptive because he's known as the heir presumptive because it's always possible that Naruhito could have another son and that would become the heir apparent. But after these 2 die, Hitahito, who has no sons, is the only one left. It's a very short line of succession. It's pretty crazy. If something were to happen to these 2 individuals, like a plane crash or something like that, the entire Japanese history is completely done. And you're probably thinking, why can't we just go back in the tree? Well, it's pretty tough to do this. Now, the last line that had any sort of connection, that had sons, were these lines here. Now, both of these lines both died out in the 1800s. And like I said, the most recent line besides them was Higashima's younger brother, Prince Yorihito. Now, this line went extinct in 1947, but it's interesting to note that when Meiji and Taisho and Komi were ruling, as they were the only sons of all these guys, and even Minko, Meiji and stuff, especially Meiji's very risky before he had his son, he was only 1 bullet away for the entire monarchy to shift over here. Now that this line is extinct, you'd have to go back several hundred years to find a male-to-male line, and by the time that would happen, most of the lines have been deemed ineligible long ago. So, in the rare case that this young boy here cannot produce any sons, the Japanese royal family is pretty much toast. And they're going to have to think of something crazy to continue it. Now, Hidehito, it is possible that he could have sons, but he's currently 88 years old, and that would be very disgusting. Please do not do that, although he is capable of creating some more heirs. But these 3 people are all Japan has left. With that, we're going to conclude the entire history from the Edo period all the way to modern day and the Japanese emperors. So, the line of succession. So if you guys want to see me do some of the older emperors, as I said, it goes all the way back to 700 BC. Let me know down in the comments. Let me know what you think about this video, and I'll definitely do that. This took a lot of work to make. It took me about a week to construct all this. So with that, thank you guys for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Wah!